Hello everyone, and welcome to NSTA Web Seminars, where you can find live interactive learning at your desktop. My name is Bryn Slate, and I'm coordinator of web seminars here at NSTA, and I'm moderating tonight's program. Jeff Lehman is here from NSTA headquarters to help out with technical questions you may have during the program. Our presentation tonight is titled Conceptual Flow, Bridging the Gap Between Standards, Instructional Materials, and Student Learning. And our presenter is DiRanna. Welcome, Kathy.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here with all of you, and thank you all for joining us. You know, there's one thing I love about technology. When you all wrote your name, I said, oh good, I'm talking to kindergartners. This will work fine. Welcome, and I'm happy to have you here with us. This is a pretty exciting time, I think, that we're living in with the new advent of the standards and the Common Core standards and even the 21st learning century skills. So I think this is a wonderful time for us to try and think about how are we going to actually translate this into what we need in our classrooms. In this session today, these are kind of our three goals. We're going to condense in this little time that we have together something that normally takes 3 hours to do. So you are just going to be aware of what it means to develop a conceptual flow. There will be a handout at the end of the session that you can refer to. It's from the book called Assessment-Centered Teaching that we wrote that has a much more detailed way of looking at what conceptual flows are. And then we'll talk a little bit about the importance of a conceptual flow as you plan for instruction and assessment and even evaluating your instructional materials. And lastly, we'll talk a little bit about how you can use this flow to connect to the Common Core standards in English language arts and also to the next generation science standards. So here we go into understanding the conceptual flow. Many of you are probably familiar with the book, How People Learn, that came out in 1999 with a revision in the year 2000, where they found three important key findings. That if we wanted to really think about how do we move students from novice to expert, what are some of the things that we need to think about? The first idea that they came up with was prior knowledge, and I'm sure many of you use that in your classroom when you ask kids whether they know about a topic. If you're a typical teacher, you ask that question and then you just go ahead and teach whatever you plan for the day anyway because you're human. But in the real world, if we could think about it, we would always try and build exactly where our kids are coming to us and what knowledge they're bringing into that room, whether it's from their life experiences or whether it's from their classroom experiences. The second important finding they had was this idea of conceptual frameworks. They looked at how experts approached the world and they realized that they had a schema that they used to do their work. Very rarely did they go back to isolated bits and pieces or little tiny facts, but almost always they had an opportunity to see a bigger idea. You see this when you watch master bridge players or master chess players who, when a person makes a move, they already have 14 moves ahead of them. If you guys are gardeners, I'm not, your plants probably grow because you know what kind of soil, fertilizer, watering they need. I have a tendency to put my tropical plants right next to my cactus, so lo and behold, that doesn't work very well. I would consider myself a novice. You might consider yourself an expert. For those of you in the elementary group, you'll relate to this easily. We know that kids have very rarely really do they have the schema on which to connect ideas. So typical in an elementary classroom, you ask the kids, the farmer has 14 pigs and 15 goats. How old is the farmer? And those of you who are elementary know that your kids will add or subtract those numbers, but most of you probably chuckled a little bit because you know that that problem can't be solved. The difference is as an adult, you have a schema for that problem. As students learning it, they don't, so they go back to bits and pieces, and we see that bigger idea. And then lastly, How People Learn focused tremendously on this idea of metacognition. How do we think about what we're thinking about? It's different than a reflection. We often in our classrooms ask kids to reflect on what they did. And often we get the play-by-play. Today I experimented with density, for example. But what we're really asking them to think about is what did I know coming in How am I thinking about it as I'm learning it? What am I struggling with? What makes sense to me? What do I still need to know? What questions are popping up in my mind? As adults, we do that all the time. I'm sure many of you have been in the shower with that aha moment when all of a sudden you say, there's the answer I've been looking for. And yet most of us really can't backtrack how we got there. So what people learn is helping us in education think about is how do we build these three key findings into the lessons that we use with students and the way we approach our curriculum and instructional materials. This talk is really based on the second idea there. How do we help build conceptual frameworks so that kids have places to hang the knowledge that they're getting? In addition to the research from how people learn, many of you have probably participated in professional learning communities, and these questions would be very familiar to you. That is the whole idea about what do we want kids to know? How do they know if they've learned it? What if we do if they haven't learned it? And what if they already know it, etc. So a conceptual flow helps us really identify clearly beyond the words in a standard, what is it that we really want kids to be able to do? As we go through this conceptual flow process, we're going to see that what it basically helps us do is really think carefully about the important concepts that kids need to know. Different from a conceptual map, it helps us identify the actual instructional sequence. What's the order in which these concepts would unfold that would help student learning? Thirdly, it helps us think about what's the most important concepts for formative assessment. We know we need to pre-test, we know we need to post-test, but in the middle of the unit when I'm instructing, what's crucial for kids to have an idea of, and if they don't have it, I can't go on any further. For example, if kids in density think only heavy things sink, I know that I have to do something with that understanding to dislodge it so that they will start to understand this relationship of mass and volume. And then lastly, the conceptual flow can really help us digest what comes to us in instructional materials. It can help us dig deeply into, do they do it conceptually? Many publishers say that they do, but when you get inside of it, they don't. Do they really have ideas that link together, and are they there for the student learning that we hope to achieve? So when we're going to build a conceptual flow, it's actually going to look something like a flow chart, or the biggest idea that you want kids to have some sense with would be found at the top, and then supporting ideas in the next level, and then smaller ideas even below that. In order to build the conceptual flow, though, you have to have a little bit of an idea about what's the difference between a small idea and a bigger idea. So for a second, we're going to step out of science, and we're going to go into Goldilocks and the Three Bears. Take just a moment to recall the story. And help me with what you would think about these ideas that I put on this chart. The Three Bears. Most of us would probably agree that that was a fact. We would probably also agree that the fact that they ate porridge was a fact. Differential heating. Not too hot, not too cold, some too hot, some too cold, some just right. Probably a bigger idea. The baby bear bed was just right. Probably a bigger idea because they had to compare it to other things. Goldilocks was a girl. Probably a fact. And breaking and entering or trespassing. Probably a bigger idea. If that made some sense to you, then what we're going to do on the next slide is we're going to ask you to think about some things in science and decide whether they are a fact or a concept. So, Bryn, is this where you come in?
Yes, Kathy, thank you. So now we're going to get to use that clip art one more time, and I have given everyone those tools. So use your clip art to stamp under each row. Do you think it is a fact or a concept? So if you have just joined us, the toolbar is on the left-hand side of the screen next to the participant and chat window, and the clip art button is the last button at the bottom. It looks like a picture of a mountain with a sun over it, so you can select that button And then you'll have access to the clip art, and click under whether you think it is a fact or a concept. So make sure to read closely the statement on the left, and then let us know whether you think it's a fact or a concept. And some of you have discovered that if you accidentally put your stamp where you don't want it, you do have the option to move it. Just use your pointer. Use the pointer button at the top of the toolbox, and you can pull that back over to where you want it to be. And it looks like we've got some good stamping and interacting going on, Kathy, so whenever you're ready to discuss the results, you can take back over.
Yeah, right, thank you. So interesting in terms of where you all put your stamps. Two of them look pretty clear. Looks like you all think that insects have 6 legs is probably a fact, and that living things demonstrate a structure-function relationship is probably a concept. You marked almost even. I think it's real hard because it's hard to tell all the markings what the first one was. The sun's energy drives the water cycle. And I see that there's a couple of you that want to put 3 states of matter in a concept, while others of you want to put it in the fact area. One of the things that we want to use in terms of trying to think about is something a fact or a concept is the idea of whether it is a discrete piece of information or whether it indicates a relationship of some kind. If you look at the insects have 6 legs, we know that's a pretty discrete piece of information. But if you look at the one above it, the sun's energy drives the water cycle, we know that in order for us to understand that, it involves quite a few relationships. The amount of energy coming from the sun, what it does to the water, the precipitation, condensation, accumulation, etc. So we would probably really consider that the first one is a concept because of the relationship, while the second one is a fact because it's a discrete piece of information. Those of you who are looking at the 3 states of matter, because it looks like we're kind of split on that one, if you think about that in terms of the naming of solid, liquid, and gas, it probably acts as a fact. If you think about how those states are related to one another, it would fall into the concept level. One of the things that confuses people a lot in terms of facts and concepts, particularly when we're working with teachers in the field, is the idea that a fact is provable and a concept is not. Concepts are, in fact, provable, no pun intended. We also have people who think that facts kind of grow up to become concepts. And what I'd like to suggest to you all is that a concept is always a concept, but how a student knows about it changes. So if I take again that first one, the sun's energy drives the water cycle, in elementary school, a kid probably just is aware of that. You say it in your classroom and they can kind of regurgitate it back to you so they're aware. In middle school, they probably have a deeper knowledge of what that means. And in high school, they probably finally are really at an understanding level about what it really means for the energy to drive that cycle. So the concept stays the same, but the level at which the kids know it changes. So with that in mind, if we look at the next slide, we have at least the definition that we use when we're working with conceptual flows. Again, this idea of the fact being discrete, the concept being more about relationships, the fact being more definitional sometimes, and the concept being more overarching. As we look at building conceptual flows, what we want to do is focus on the concepts. We already do a lot of good on facts. Most of us teach a lot of facts. The idea here is, can you go up to the bigger idea that the kids might need to build their schema on? So how do we even start doing a conceptual flow? We start, first of all, let me say it's a little strange doing this on this kind of platform on a webinar, because usually we're sitting together with a group of people where you individually do something and then you would share your work with your partners. So we're going to kind of try and see if we can simulate that with us tonight. The prompt that we ask is this prompt: what should an exiting blank grader know about blank? And we have to be very careful with the teachers and tell them we're not asking for behavioral objectives. So I don't want the kids to identify 3 rocks. I want to know, what about the 3 rocks do you want them to know? So when you think about this, we're really trying to map out just the content, not how the kids are going to come to know that. So what I'd like us to try for tonight is for you to answer the prompt that's below it. What should an exiting 8th grader know about the properties of matter? Now, some of you are in elementary, just guesstimate what you think might happen in middle school. And for you at the high school and in college, think back to what you think kids might be exploring. And if you would just take a moment to type in some responses in your chat, we'll look at some of the ideas you've got going.
So some people have already started entering their responses there in the chat, and go ahead and type in what you think an exiting 8th grader should know about the properties of matter.
So I see some of our answers range from they should know about matter taking up mass and having mass and taking mass and volume and taking up space, some of them about they're interchangeable depending on the energy in each phase, the idea that they should know the particulate nature of matter, that energy is involved in this, to differentiate between chemical and physical changes, phase change. I'm just trying to understand small-scale, microscopic explanations of macroscopic observations. So we have a lot of ideas generated in terms of how you might answer this question. When we conduct this for real in our 3-hour sessions, you would ask people to actually write an entire paragraph about what they think this would be, trying to concentrate on the biggest ideas possible. And then you would ask them to look at their statements that they made in their paragraph and say which of these are concepts and which of these statements are facts. And then the funnest part of all is you give them 3 different size Post-its. Big Post-its, middle-size Post-its, and little smaller Post-its. And you ask them to write every single sentence on the Post-it representing how big they think that idea is. So on whatever they think are their very biggest ideas, they would put on the large Post-it. If they think it's a medium-sized idea, they would put it on a smaller Post-it. And if it's more of a factoid kind of thing, they'd put it on a little bitty Post-it. Everybody would do that individually. And then in a group, you would play the Post-it game. Somebody in your group would actually say, well, I think this is a big idea, and they put it on the table. And other people would contribute to it if they had a similar idea. Sometimes in a group, somebody says it's a big idea, and somebody else says, no, I think it's a little tiny fact. And one of the very nice things about Post-its is that you can make them be bigger or smaller by simply folding them if they're too big, or putting them on a bigger size Post-it if that's what you need to do. But you continue to negotiate the conversation of all the ideas on the table, and then you come up with what we call the collaborative pre-think, and it looks something like this. You can see that there's a bunch of different size Post-its on here. Some are overlapping one another, but this one happens to be on cells, and it's too hard for any of us to really read it. But it is the idea that there were 4 people involved in this. Their bigger ideas are that the cells are the building blocks of which all living things are made, and then some ideas underneath that clumped in ways that this group thought it might go together. It's messy, as you can see. It takes a while to negotiate, but the conversations about content that come from this are extremely important and often eye-opening. You're not allowed to write just a topic, so you don't just get to say kinetic theory. You have to say, what are we talking about? You actually have to use sentences to try and describe what it is, what the content is that you want kids to know. This works whether you're an elementary, middle school, or high school teacher. Obviously, the amount of content that gets written will differ, usually based on the grade level that you teach. But the ideas are very much the same in terms of the process that unfolds. So this is what a real one looks like. This is what one looks like when it gets typed up. You take all those Post-its and actually try and put it together. So this one is the one that was designed in answer to the prompt that I gave you. What are some of the characteristics of matter? What do you think kids should know about? And this group of teachers who did this, you can see there's a big strand over here on density, and then there's some stuff about the atoms and the way that they combine together. Conceptual flows do not have to match one another. In other words, the one that you made may look very different from one that another group of teachers would make. But the idea is to try and get a team of teachers teaching at the same school to say these are the ideas that we think are most important for our kids to know, and this is how we see these things connected to one another. So the arrows that are drawn there are to try and help us know how the ideas are actually connected. I'll give you a second to scan that. And then I'm just going to ask us to focus on the gray side of the material. And you look at just the gray scaled boxes. You notice that it says density is a characteristic property of matter, and that's talking about the relationship with mass and volume, and that it can be used to predict behavior, and you can follow the flow down with those arrows. What I'm going to ask you to think about now is if this is the content that you want kids to know something about, and this seems to be the order that makes some sense to you, what would formative assessment look like? Where would you find critical places that you would actually want to say, do the kids know this? If they don't know it, I can't go on in my teaching. So when you think about critical points, we're talking about something that we call juncture assessments. A pre-test is what you give before, a post-test is at the end, but the juncture is like, where do you dip in along the way so that you know what kids are thinking? And you're going to dip in on purpose because you say, they've got to get it. At this point, if they don't have it, I have to reteach, I have to do it in a different way. What are those critical junctures where you really need to know where the kids are in their thinking? So what we're going to ask you to do now is I'm going to put this back up, and we're going to ask, Brenda will moderate this, but what we're going to do is we're going to try and flag this on places that you think would be critical to know what kids know before you could go on to the next idea. So Bryn, it's yours.
Thanks, Kathy, and everyone. Your tools are now available once again, and you can use the clip art tool. Again, it's the last button on the row there. It looks like a mountain with a sun over it. And use your clip art to stamp where you think assessment should be done. And Kathy, did you want them to continue focusing on the gray side with density?
They can focus there, but if they want to add some other ones, that would be fine too. So we're going to talk about the density side most of all.
Okay, great. So I see a lot of you have already started stamping where you think assessment should go, but if you haven't had a chance to put your stamp up, go ahead and put it up there now. And maybe try to leave the words uncovered so we can still see, but I know it's hard to sometimes place it exactly where you want to. Kathy, it looks like we've got quite a...
We're still stamping.
Yep. We've got some stamps moving across the screen, and we've got more stamps coming up.
So one of the fun things on this is you guys continue to stamp is if we could follow one person's stamping, it probably would make a little bit more sense to us about where that one person thought were the critical junctures to look at student understanding. But it does look like there's a cluster about the biggest idea up at the top, that matter has properties and that those properties can change. And that would be one of those really big ideas that probably would be along the way you'd want to be knowing, can kids relate whatever they're learning back to that bigger idea. So it would be part of the pre-assessment, part of the post, and certainly can be incorporated into the juncture assessments. It also looks that like a lot of you wanted them to understand the idea about the relationship between mass and volume. And one of the things that we do know about density when we're teaching it to kids is that that is actually a very key idea in their learning. Most kids come in simply thinking that dense means close together or stupid, or it means that you're going to sink, because if you're heavy, you sink. And so all of those need to be fleshed out further for kids to really understand this relationship between mass and volume. And then you can see that there are some other places that you scattered your ideas, probably based on how you were best thinking about this in your own classroom. This process, again, takes a while because it's something that the team would negotiate, because once they decide what concepts are really important to assess, the team then can sit down and say, what are our common assessments going to look like? If this is the content we want kids to know, if this is the way in which we're teaching it, the order in which we're teaching it, here's our assessment points, and now how do we develop some common assessments so that we can really talk about student work and what they're telling us. So teachers like yourselves had this map in front of them, and when they decided to flag it, it looked like this. They decided that there were 4 important assessments for them. And again, you may disagree, and that's fine. This is a matter, again, of the group saying, this is what we think is most important. And so they wanted really the kids to understand the relationship of mass and volume, the idea about constant pressure, it doesn't change, and the idea that the relative densities will tell you whether something sinks and floats. So for this school, they sat down and said, all right, this is what we want to teach. These are the places that we would test on the density side. They did not yet flag the other side of this flow, which would be their next move. And then, as I said, they would be able to determine the common assessments that they want to do with each other. So at this point, what we're going to do is go forward for a second and just do kind of a review about what happens when we do a conceptual flow. When I asked you the very first prompt, what should an exiting 8th grader know about matter, then that's what we call that individual pre-think. You would write that in a paragraph form. You'd look at your statements. You'd say, these are big ideas, these are smaller ideas, and then you would put them on the Post-its according to what size you thought they might be. Secondly, with your team, you would talk about those Post-its and you'd try and come up with one big conceptual flow that incorporates everybody's Post-its. When you find things in common, you just double stick them. When you find places that you disagree, somebody thought it was a big idea, somebody else thought it was a small idea, then you negotiate that until you can get that arranged. And then you end up and you have what we call the collaborative pre-think. That was the green slide that I showed you with the green Post-its all over it. At that point, you put that aside and you take your instructional materials, and this is a time, in the best of all worlds, every single person would read the module or the chapter that has the content that you want to teach. But sometimes those modules can be very long, and sometimes the chapters can be very long, so you might choose to do a jigsaw. But what you're wanting to do is you are wanting to sit down and actually read the entire whatever in your instructional materials that addresses the topic that you're trying to teach. So what you do is you start reading. For example, if I were in a FOSS kit on mixtures and solutions, I would start reading through every single investigation. And what I'm reading with is I'm reading everything that the kids are doing, and I'm deciding what the concepts are. And again, I'm going to write them on a big Post-it if I think it's a really big idea, on a medium-sized Post-it, or on a small Post-it if I think it's a factoid. If I were in high school, I'd be reading the chapter on evolution, and I would be doing the exact same kind of thing. Big ideas, medium, and small. Again, after you get done reading your materials, if you've done it as a jigsaw, you come back together and you make your jigsaw one conceptual flow that represents exactly how the materials represent those concepts to you. I'm going to say that one again because it's really important. When you do the conceptual flow in your instruction materials, you don't get to edit what the publishers did. You have to write it the way they wrote it. You may disagree with it. You may want to rearrange it later. But for right now, you want to try and really capture what concepts do they have, what order do they come in, are they big ideas or are they small ideas. Okay? When you've got that, you now have two conceptual flows. You have the one that you did out of your own understanding, and now you have the one that the instructional materials have. And your next job, step number 4, is to kind of put those two together. What you're looking for here is what prior knowledge did you bring in? That's your collaborative pre-think. What did the publishers think? And where do you see a blend? Sometimes your ideas will be theirs, and you just overstack them. And sometimes they'll have ideas that you didn't have, and sometimes you'll have ideas that the publishers didn't have. So what number 5 is, you're going to then align them in a way that makes the most sense to you so that you could be able to actually say, this is the order in which I think they might go. And then the very last step on this one, still in number 5, is this idea of saying, have we addressed the standards that we're responsible for teaching? And you actually go back and you flag your conceptual flow wherever those standards go. That helps a lot in terms of helping us understand, are our standards big ideas? Are they medium ideas? Are they small ideas? Where do they fall in the flow that you're actually teaching? It also helps us know sometimes, and I'll just use California as an example, sometimes in my pre-think, because I know my students, I know that they're going to come in lacking some understanding that I know they have to have before we can start the unit. So I'm going to end up having a little cluster for which there's no standards that are going to be related to it because I just know I have to do catch-up. The kids didn't get it in the grades before. So this allows me to have a little cluster that is kind of my professional judgment about what my kids need. And then we're going to go into the flow that is a combination of my pre-think and the instructional materials and the standards mapping. It also helps sometimes because sometimes you go, wow, there's this pile of standards, I can't fit this in this unit. And you actually recognize that there needs to be another instructional unit that those standards would apply to. So you move them over and you design another conceptual flow to incorporate those. When you're done, you have your original pre-think, the group's pre-think, you have your instructional materials, and you have the standards. And all of that now is on one map. And you finally put it in the order that makes the most sense to you so that you can gain the best student understanding that you can get. And once you have that order all together, then you would sit down and actually flag to say where are the assessments, what's the pre, what's the post, and what are some of the junctures that we would put in between. Now, I know that's a lot, and that's why I said that you do have a handout that will help reiterate what I just went through in terms of these steps. I want to say one other thing about these flows. If you go back up to number 3, where it says to read the concepts in the instructional materials, when you do that for real, you actually, when you make your map, you actually draw arrows between the concepts. If it's a really strong arrow, what you're saying is, wow, this really links. The publisher left off here, they started here, the kids are going to be right with us, this is a great alignment. Or many times you're going to end up with a dotted line, which says, yeah, this is really, really weak. And sometimes there's going to be no arrow because it's like, who was smoking what when they wrote this? It just doesn't connect to each other. So when you look at that map with the arrows and the strength of the arrows, you can actually look at your instructional materials and say, A, what concepts do they teach? Are they connected in any way that makes any sense? And am I going to get some decent student learning out of this? So that's another way in which this conceptual flow can be used to evaluate those instructional materials. Some people ask, well, what happens if I really don't know all the content I'm responsible for teaching in a conceptual flow? Way back in that pre-think when you asked me to write, what happens if I don't know very deeply what I'm supposed to know? And I'm going to refer us to the idea that if we believe how people learn applies to everybody, it means that it applies to us. So we always want to start with what prior knowledge are we bringing to the table. It may be not very much. It may be a plethora of ideas. Whatever it is, and that's what you start with. We also don't start with standards for the exact same reason. The standards are somebody else's thinking. This is you, the teacher. What do you think about this content, and what do you think is important for kids to know? So we're basing that on the prior knowledge. Once you and your colleagues, though, have started to write their conceptual flow, that's the time when you say, all right, this is what we know. Are there things we should know more about? And so some of these resources that are on this slide are certainly places that you might want to go to. Some of you probably know Science Matters. It's a great book on just general ideas in science. Of course, our National Science Education Standards as they currently stand. The Curriculum Topic Study that helps us a lot with kids' misconceptions. The benchmarks, the AAAS benchmarks. And now coming to us soon in December will be our brand new Next Generation Science Standards. The framework that is currently out right now has a lot of big ideas in it so that you can actually look through there and find more content if you need to. You would look at those resources, add to your conceptual flow if you felt like you needed it, and then you would still have all the steps that we were just talking about back here until you actually came out with a flow that you thought was reasonable. Oops. So we are here.
Okay, Kathy, it looks like we're at our first question break, so this is a chance for all of you participants to enter in any questions you'd like to ask Kathy right now. I do have one saved from Diane from earlier in the program, and she asked, do you tie this with standard statements? Which I guess you just addressed, but if you want to answer that in addition.
Sure. I just would say the answer, of course, is yes. We do use the standards. It's just that they are not the first thing that you start with. Because, again, the rationale for this is part of a professional development to help teachers really think deeply about the content they need to teach. So we want to start with the prior knowledge that you bring to the room, and then later on formally look at, have you addressed the standards that you're supposed to address?
Thank you, Kathy, for reiterating that, and thanks, Diane, for the question. Angela has one. She wants to know, what if you're not working with the group? Is this ridiculous? Is doing this alone a ridiculous thought?
No, not at all, because one of the things that it really does help push you on is what do you understand about the content that you're teaching. You know, many of us, no matter what grade level you're at, you know, I'm a biologist by training, and so I go, well, I teach mitosis. So one of the questions, you know, that you need to ask yourself is, so what? What about mitosis is that you want the kids to know? So whatever grade level you're teaching and whatever topic, this is a good reflective practice for you to say, what do I value? What do I know? What do I value? What do I think my kids need to know? And in what order does it play out? The other reason to do this, whether you're doing it by yourself or in a group, is that when you get all done with this, if you can turn it into a graphic organizer that your kids can use, we've seen people put these flows up on the wall so that the kids always have a sense of where they are. We have people who like to do more inquiry-based instruction, so they roll it up on the wall and it kind of unfolds as they develop the story. It's great for English language learners because they have a way to kind of mark where they are. It helps kids to see that while we're doing this small little experiment over here, it really relates to that bigger idea. So I would encourage you that even if you're by yourself, it's a good practice to get into.
Thanks, Kathy. That was a great question, Angela. And we have one from Rochelle, and a few people have already responded in the chat, but she was wondering, she says she hasn't started teaching yet, but hopes to start in the fall. And she asks, are plans used from year to year? So you might do this you might not do this for every unit for every year.
Right. So what we have found in terms of actual teacher practice with this is that the first time you write one, whether you do it by yourself or in a group, you suck at it. And I mean that politely. It's not easy to do. It's a different way of thinking for many of us. And so what we find is that teachers make it, they teach from it, and then they automatically start modifying it. And so if you teach the same content year after year, you can finally come up with flows that you really like, and you found the right sources to help you teach that out. So what I would always say is this is a process of continuous improvement, and it's a habit of mind. So do you have to keep doing it every year? The answer is no, but you will find that you will because you get to see the nuances of this, and it so much helps you understand where your students are that you just kind of get engaged and hooked on this as a way of thinking about how you teach. Do you want me to take another question, Bryn? Have I lost you?
I'm sorry about that. Patricia
Hello?
wanted to know, can you hear me now, Kathy?
I can.
Okay.
I can.
I'm sorry about that. Patricia wanted to know, do you in the conceptual flow show the connections between the upcoming Next Generation Science Standards and the Common Core standards?
Okay, great question. The answer is for the Next Generation Science Standards, you will be able to map those onto the flow because, as you probably already know, the core ideas that are part of those Next Generation Science Standards would be what you would be putting on here. What you're not mapping the first time through is you're not mapping the practices and you're not mapping the cross-cutting themes. You're mapping the core discipline ideas. So those go on there with absolutely no problem. If you look at the Common Core standards for English language arts, particularly in writing and reading, you're probably looking more at something that you might do at a lesson level rather than at this larger grain size of what's the content that you're teaching. But you could take a section of your conceptual flow and say, I think this is where I want the kids to make sure that they do claims and evidence as a writing sample. And so I can flag that section of the conceptual flow for doing that. Or this is where I want the kids to be engaged in a project-based learning where they're going to have to do presentations, and then you could map that on. But the content for content, the Next Generation Science Standards will allow you to do that.
Thanks, Kathy, and thank you, Patricia, for the question. And Kathy, I think we're ready to move on to the next section.
Okay. All right. I did see somebody ask about whether students could do this or not. I think one of the things that would be great is for them to create it as you go along the way with your kids. Most of the kids probably don't have the ideas about what concepts they need to know, but as you're teaching them, it would be fun for them to even do just regular conceptual mapping, where they just draw ideas and show connections. So I just wanted to make a point of that. Okay, so where we're going next is really to have this idea about, so if I've got this tool, this conceptual flow, how's it going to help me think about the really cool new opportunities that we have? I don't know how old I look to you in my picture, but I'm old. I've been around for a while, and I'm really excited that in the 25 years that I've been doing professional development, we seem to now be back at a pendulum that's kind of saying, bring science back, put it back on the front burner, not on the back burner, and let's see if we can really do this in a way in which kids think. And so this intersect between the Common Core standards, which are asking for application, the idea of the next generation science standards that intertwines the three big ideas, and this whole idea of the 21st century skills where I have information fluency and I know how to work in groups and I can communicate. All of these things are really, I think, pointing us towards the direction of creative, intuitive, logical, wonderful opportunities for kids to put their learning to good use and to really do something with it and get out of the drill and kill or no science that we've been in for the last 10 years. So I hope that many of you were able to listen to the webinar that was presented even just yesterday on the next generation science standards. I know that we have a varying degree in this audience about what you know about this, so just fly-by overview. The idea is that these three labels, the practices, the content, and the cross-cutting ideas, would form the basis of what we look at when we look at these standards. For those of you who are used to the word inquiry, it's embedded in the practices, and the practices are expanded to include engineering practices as well as science. So how do we do science and how do we do engineering? The core ideas in the discipline are really the big ideas. It is that whole concept of this conceptual framework. How do kids hang their hat somewhere? What are those bigger ideas that tie the discipline together? And as you would expect, there's one in life, one in earth, one in physical, but they also have one in engineering and technology, so that's been added to it. And the cross-cutting concepts are those that go across disciplines, so that kids understand that energy in photosynthesis is related to energy in convection cycles, is related to energy that for melting an ice cube, that they actually can see that it crosses life, earth, and physical and into the engineering and technology ideas. So the standards are up for review right now. If you want to do that, please make sure you go to the website and put your reviews in by June 1st. They are supposed to be out for real by December. The 26 states that are helping to review them have more reviews, and there will be yet another public review in the fall. But the targeted date is to make these live and ready to go in December, which means that most of your states are gearing up for trying to figure out how they're going to use them in their state. In California, for example, we passed a new bill that says we have to have it together by March 2013, which means I hope we're just going to adopt them as they are and then figure it all out. So what I'd like us to do is to try and think a little bit about what these standards are and see how we might apply them in a situation. So we've been talking about density, and we're just going to do a virtual activity here. This is the directions that were given to the kids in an 8th grade classroom where they were supposed to, by themselves, take notes on what they thought sample 1 and sample 2, make some observations, and to use all of their senses except taste. And you can see this is a summation of what the kids thought about. Number 1 was clear, no smell, stayed on the finger when touched, it doesn't cling to the side of the cup. 2 is clear, it has smell, cools your finger and it seems to evaporate and it clings to the side of a cup. So they were given that observation and they wrote them down individually. Then they turned to a partner and shared their ideas with one another so that they had a lot of oral rehearsal. They were practicing statements, discussing with each other. If one saw an observation the other didn't, that they were able to incorporate that. Then they were asked this question. Here's some ice, stick it in each ice cube, and what do you observe? So at this point, you would be typing some responses in the chat room about what you saw in cup number 1 and what you noticed in cup number 2.
So go ahead and use that chat box to type in your observations of the pictures of cup number 1 and cup number 2.
And as I look at the responses that are coming up, what we would hope that our 8th grade kids would know that right now what they're doing is making observations only. It's not an explanation. So this idea about in number 1, it looks like it's floating, and in the number 2, it sank, would be the kind of observation that would want the kids to be making. And then, at this point, after they've made these observations and talked and compared with each other along the way, you would actually ask them to go to a whiteboard and draw what they think was happening on that whiteboard. We're not going to do that today because we don't have time to look at your lovely pictures, but we are going to ask you to write about how you know which materials have the same greater or less density. So Bryn, back to you.
Thanks, Kathy. So now we'll take 3 volunteers to write in boxes 1, 2, and 3 your explanation of the same, greater, or less density. So if you'd like to volunteer to use your text box tool to type on the whiteboard, you can use the raise hand button, and I will select you. So let's see, I've got one hand. Okay, Angela, you're number 1, so I'll give you the tools. Maureen, you're number 2, so I'll give you the tools. And we have one more volunteer. All right, we're still waiting on 3, but Angela and Maureen. Okay, Kathleen, great. You will write in box number 3. So again, the toolbar is on the left-hand side of your screen, and you should be able to use that text box tool. It's the 4th button down. It has an A on it. And just select next to your number if you're 1, 2, or 3, and type your explanation there in the box. Looks like Kathleen's got it and is typing. Angela, if you need help, just type me a message in the chat box. Otherwise, you can go ahead and start typing. And same with Maureen. If you need help, let me know by typing into the chat, but otherwise go ahead and start typing in your box. And if you're not, okay, great. I see Maureen started to type. Angela, if you're not able to do it, just let me know and I will select another volunteer for box 1. Okay, it looks like Angela's having trouble, so I'll take one more volunteer for box 1. Oh, there she is. Coming up, so thanks Angela for typing in. So we've got our 3 volunteers, and it looks like Kathleen is finished. And just give us a thumbs up when you're finished typing, ladies. Okay, Kathy. Kathleen, give us a thumbs up, so we'll just wait on Maureen and Angela to finish their explanations.
Okay, it looks like all 3 hands are up.
It looks like they're finished typing. Just let us know, ladies, if you're not finished. But Kathy, it does look like they're finished, so you can take it away.
Okay. Okay. So the purpose of having you all do this is because we're going to actually come back to what you wrote here in a moment. But the idea is that in trying to look at both the Common Core standards and to look at the next generation standards is an opportunity for kids to make some explanations about what they see happening. So in this activity, some of you I saw in the chat said one is water and one is alcohol, and that's true. What we would want the kids at this point to do is not necessarily know that alcohol is alcohol, just know that that liquid is probably not the same as it was in one, and they can tell that from their early observations because it has an odor, it evaporates on their fingers, etc. But in fact, then she used their observations to say which one would be more dense or less dense based on where the ice cube actually is. So we're going to freeze this frame just for a moment, and we're going to go ahead thinking that what the kids have now done is they've done a kind of a dot diagram trying to show the difference in the density. They've talked to each other, they've written this, drawn their picture, and then now they've actually written a statement. So what I want you to do as a group for a second is go back in your mind to the practices that we have in the next generation science standards, and these are the 8 of them that are listed for you, and to think about the activity. What do you think was the best practice in this activity that we just had? And so do you think it was a practice that would really help kids understand how to ask questions and define problems? Do you think it was something for developing and using models, etc.? And I see some of you are already starting to mark it, so Bryn, I'll turn it back to you.
Okay, great, Kathy. So everyone now has access to clip art tools again. So use those tools to stamp where you think the best practice in this activity was. And we'll give everyone just a moment to submit their vote. So it looks like everybody made a mark. Yes, it looks like everyone has put their stamp up. So if you want to take over the discussion.
Okay. So thank you all for putting your marking down. You can see that the majority of you put it somewhere in about analyzing and interpreting data. One of the interesting things about the new next generation science standards is the way the performance expectations are written. This, in fact, might be an activity in which that was the expectation. Could kids analyze and interpret some of their data? But you'll see by where you marked other things, there certainly were other practices involved in that. Certainly the idea about being able to write a statement had to do with communicating information. So even though the next generation science standards expectancy might say that kids will analyze and interpret data about density, that was the expectation, we see in fact that in order for them to do that, they had to be able to do some of these other practices. So as we think about the standards, the idea of these practices is that they are interwoven, they often build on each other, and the expectancies, the things that you will be assessed on in a new science assessment, would be if it's called out as we want the kids to analyze data about density, then that would be the expectancy. And yet, as I said, you can see that they would be using many other practices in order to be able to get there. I think what that helps us with, all of us who are fighting the good cause for saying that science needs to be inquiry-based and kids doing things, it continues to reinforce the idea that you can't just do this haphazardly. Kids have to be taught the skills and the ideas on how to do this, and most of these end up being critical thinking skills that help them anywhere. So let's move onward. These were the engineering practices. The third part of the Next Generation Science Standards is the idea of the cross-cutting concepts. So we're going to go to the next page, and you'll look at the 7 ideas that are listed as these cross-cutting concepts. Now remember, these are ideas that you think would link to something in life, earth, physical, and engineering and technology. So when you think back on this small activity, where might it flow? Does it fit any of these cross-cutting concepts? And Bryn, back to you for...
Thanks, Kathy. And everyone now has the screen marking tools, so you can go ahead and place your clip art next to the best cross-cutting concept in the ICE experiment that we just took part in. So go ahead and use that clip art to place your answer in the box. Sorry about that. You should all now have the tools. There we go.
Okay, so can we go forward?
Yes, Kathy, it looks like most people have had a chance to put their stamp up, so if you want to take it away.
Okay, and as you can all see, many of you marked the idea of a cause and effect mechanism and explanation. And you know, we know that that's an idea that's going to show up in life, earth, and physical science as well as technology and engineering. So the cross-cutting concepts, the idea of this would be that in order for kids to really start to see these ideas, it would be something that would happen over and over and over again. This would be just one very, very small little example of starting to set up this idea of cross-cutting concepts. As a teacher during the year, you might even post these on the wall, and when you have kids doing these things, you know, ask them what do they notice it being, what's the bigger idea that again might be helping them organize their thinking about what they're doing. Cause and effect is certainly the basis of what we do in science, so it's one of the most crucial ones for us to pay attention to. Again, you notice that some of you marked some other things, and it very well could be part of that. Those different things, stability and change, for example. And you would then make the case as you were using this activity to go across to the different disciplines and show that it is an idea that is supported in all of those. I just noticed as we were going in the chat room that somebody had made a statement about how unclear or unspecific the next generation science standards are. I think one of the, and I'd just like to comment on that briefly, I do think that one of the things they're trying to help us think about is what are these practices, what are the core ideas within the discipline, what are these cross-cutting ideas. Those are the stuff that you need to teach. The expectancies as they're being written are trying to say that if there was a test item, you would have to be able to put those three things together in the way that it's written on that expectancy. So, for example, the expectancy for this activity, if it were an activity that was a test item, would be, could kids analyze data, analyze and interpret data about density as an example of a cause and effect situation. That would be taking the practice, analyze the data, the core idea, density, and the cross-cutting concept, cause and effect. And yet you would see that you would be hitting many other things in having kids learn this, not just that one idea. I do think the standards are written in a way that we're going to need lots of professional development and lots of help in instructional materials to make them work in classrooms. But the broadness that they give us is trying to help us create these conceptual frameworks and build bridges where before everything was pretty much in silos. So as we look at this activity, it helps demonstrate what an activity in the next generation standards might look like. I'm going to pause here to answer any questions that you might have.
And Kathy, since we only have less than 10 minutes left at this point, I think that we should probably keep moving forward, and then if we have additional time before the end, we can answer those questions before moving to the evaluation. And if not, we can catch those after the evaluation. What do you think?
All righty. I think that's fine. We can do that. So what I'm going to ask us to do for a second is go back to this slide where we wrote about the whiteboard entry, and just to remind ourselves that we made some individual observations, we talked to our partner, we wrote some stuff, we drew pictures, we had lots of different kinds of activities here, and we actually took a moment to write down what might be some explanations for this density. So where we're going now is to this slide, which is our introduction to how does this activity help us think about the Common Core in English language arts. And we did this in a way that it can apply whether you're in the K-5 Common Core or whether you're in the 6-12 Common Core. So as you look at the oral and written language that is in both strands, K-12, just to yourself for a moment, think about if you were doing this real time, what kinds of thinking and what kinds of products would have helped you think about the oral and the written language. And if you had a moment and you asked your kids in your classrooms after they had drawn their whiteboards and written their explanations, and you asked them to stand up and present what they had discovered, you would be meeting this standard. It's the California Common Core. I don't know if we modified this one or not. But this one, it's a standard that says they can present claims and findings, an argument, a narrative, a response to literature. That would not be part of it, but it would be the argument. And they would have to emphasize the salient points and talk about relevant evidence and give the details, etc. So by doing this activity in your science classroom, you in fact would be addressing one of the oral language standards in the Common Core. Likewise, if you think about the writing that you did, I'm going to put this up and let you scan it for a second and think about the writing that we did and see if it might address any of these. So certainly, if you look at B through D, you would in fact probably say, even in the short writing that we did do some things with some concrete details. We linked them, we compared and contrasted what was happening in one solution and the other, and we were looking for some specific language, academic vocabulary, using density in its appropriate ways. So again, by doing this activity in a science classroom, you are having kids practice these Common Core standards for written language. If this activity went on as part of a unit, you might have them then write a 5-paragraph essay doing a lot of what's on this standard and drawing from what they did in the activities that they did with density. So one of the things that we want to think about when you look at both the Common Core and you look at the next generation science standards is this idea of rigor and relevance. And what we know is that when you're in none of these quadrants are more important than the other. They all have their place, but it really is about trying to be appropriate for purpose. So when you ask kids to do routine memorization, it has low rigor and it has low relevance. When you ask them to do some hands-on activities without any explanation, it has low rigor, but it's relevant because they're engaged in it. When you ask them to do complex analytical thinking, it's high rigor, but not always relevant to them. But when you ask them to actually apply it in a real-world setting, then you get the highest rigor and the highest relevance. So what we know about both sets of standards is we are trying to get to what's being called the quadrant D moment. How do you help kids really be part of that kind of learning? We've spent a lot of time down in the A quadrant. The question that we really want to know is, how does science help you get to those quadrant D moments? And just using this simple example, we've seen a way that you can have them engaged in hands-on, that you could talk about what does that mean in the real world to them, and you could go on from there. So just a little bit in conclusion about where we've been is we introduced this idea of the conceptual flow as a way to organize the content that we're responsible for teaching, to make sure that we see how our instructional materials support it, to make sure that it incorporates a set of standards that we're responsible for teaching, and to look, when we get at that level of a lesson or an activity, how are those standards embedded in what we're doing? And so in the activity we did today, we had a chance to debrief it, saying here were some of the practice and here were some of the cross-cutting concepts. We did not debrief today about the content of density. We could have, but we didn't. And then on the activity from the Common Core side, we looked at it entirely as a thing for communication, both in oral language and in written language, to help them, provide them with these quadrant D moments. And so as we come to the conclusion of this session, one of the things I'd like you to reflect on is how you might use this conceptual flow in your own context and how it can help you think about how to do the Common Core standards and the next generation science standards. And that's our last slide. We are ready to go on to pausing and asking for questions.
So we have time for perhaps one question here before moving on to the conclusion. So if anyone has a quick question they'd like to enter, do so now, and I will have Kathy answer that. But I don't see, let's see if anyone's typing in their chat box here. And it looks like there are no questions at this time, Kathy, so we'll move on to the conclusion, and then participants can ask at the end after the evaluation. So I'd like to go ahead and thank you now, Kathy, for a fantastic presentation. It was super engaging, and all of the interactivity was fabulous. So I'd like to thank you, Kathy, and have everyone give you a round of applause using their emoticon buttons. I'd also like to thank the GE Foundation for sponsoring tonight's web seminar. And a reminder to visit the Learning Center, your source for over 6,000 resources for teachers and a place to register for future web seminars to find additional content like this. We'd like to thank the administration of NFTA for their support for web seminars. And here's our upcoming web seminar program list. On May 22nd, Designing Effective Science Instruction. Then on May 23rd, one in our NASA Explorer Schools series, Ultraviolet Radiation and Yeast, Radiation Biology. And on May 24th, one from the American Chemical Society, Matter, Solids, Liquids, and Gases, introducing a free online resource for middle school chemistry. If you're listening to this program on an archive, we'd like to encourage you to join us for a live web seminar soon, and I'd like to thank everyone for their participation.